Hey, I'm Sean Teis. Welcome back to Let's Talk About Fatherlessness. I'm excited to have my guest today, Anna Meade Harris. It's great to have you with us today, Anna.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this conversation, Sean.
I was told about your book by our mutual friend Lori Apon, and she thought it'd be great, a great guest for our show. And I'm excited, even just looking at the book right now, God's Grace for Every Family, and that's such an incredible topic. I mean, because we all need that, every family. But yours is focused on single parents. And so tell us a little bit about, before we dive into the book, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your ministry and what you're involved in, and how you got to do what you do.
Right. So, well, I've been a single mom since 2010. My husband passed away after about a 15-month battle with colon cancer. And at the time, our three sons were 9, 12, and 13 years old. And so obviously the issues surrounding single parenting are very personal to me. But for work, I work for Rooted Ministry, which is a ministry that really supplies content and support to youth pastors and parents. Really, anyone who is discipling teenagers, hopefully to lifelong faith in Jesus Christ. I run our content division, which is the blog, the podcasts, the YouTube channel, and publishing. And so I was professionally interested in the family as well. And so those two things kind of came together as I realized that there's just very little Christian content for the single parent. Even the very best parenting books for Christians often fail to acknowledge that there are single parents in the church and raising kids. And so I really started to see that there was kind of a gap there. And I wanted to write this book to encourage single parents, but also to help church members learn how to love single parents well.
That's wonderful, and it goes right along with what we do. We go and we've spoken in over 200 churches on the issue of fatherlessness, and we try to challenge churches to get involved in visiting the fatherless. We use the verse James 1:27, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit them, and we try to explain to them the fatherless there. It's talking about a child that's lost a mom or a dad or both. Or the widow there is talking about a woman who's lost her husband due to death or abandonment. And we try to tell people like, hey, who's that single mom in your circle of influence? Who's that grandparent raising grandkids that's down the street from you? And so we're going right along with what you're saying, is letting the church people know, hey, get involved. And so I love this message. I think that's a great tool. I'm really excited about this new book. Tell us more about your story. And before we dive into the book, though, you said your husband passed away, and then I'm sure that was really hard. Can you tell us about some of the ways that you healed through that? Just to
Mm.
encourage other single moms out there, widows out there that may be going through it right now. We have friends and people we know that they're going through that, and it's even more fresh for them because it's happened recently. Would you tell us about how you were able to overcome?
Well, for a long time, I didn't feel like we would.
Mm.
I felt very ill-equipped to parent on my own. I think married parents realize what a challenge it is to raise kids and to do it well and to teach them to learn to love Jesus, especially in the culture that we have now. And so when I found myself parenting alone, it was beyond daunting, and I really was confronted with all the ways in which I was not enough
Mm.
to meet all of their needs. And I have not learned to be enough. I have learned to ask for help and accept help and allow friends who are family by also being part of the body of Christ, those friends who are family to come alongside us and care for our family in really personal ways. When you talk about visiting the widow and the orphan and the fatherless, that was something that really happened for us a lot. And that visiting can look a lot of ways, but we were often invited to join in on holiday celebrations with other families, but also just on a Sunday afternoon, come over and swim in their swimming pool and grill
That's
out. Um, and just participate in the everyday life of other families. Nothing special, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but people in our church and Christians in other churches too. You don't have to limit it to those who are actually in the congregation with you.
mhm.
Uh, Reached out to us and really enfolded our family into theirs. Got to know my kids as well as me. So by coming close and just making friends, they began to see what the needs were and learn how to meet them as one friend would for another. For example, all three of my sons were offered summer jobs,
That's
from
great.
a couple from members of our congregation, another member of another congregation, but they knew they could see a need. These kids are 15, 16, 17. They need summer jobs. Why don't they come work with me? And then they have an opportunity to really develop a relationship, teach them something about what it is to have a job, and it took a little pressure off of me because I wasn't standing over them saying, "It's time for you to get a summer job." So that's just a one example of a need that they saw, that friends saw in our family, and in seeing the need, I became less lonely. I
Mm.
became less isolated, knowing that there were people who would help me and people who saw our family and understood what we needed and did what they could to meet us there.
Yeah, I love what you said about the job part because that impacted my life. I had somebody that gave me a job, and then they became basically my second family,
Mhm.
and it's same thing. And so this couple, Jim and Deb, I started working at their house, doing things for them. Then I started working for Jim's business, in like car washes and air machines and vacuums at
Right.
different gas stations. So I started working with him and doing all this stuff. And so I slowly became part of the family. And I was
Mhm.
not there was no blood relation, no marriage relation. I wasn't adopted. I didn't live with them, but it was the fact that I got to spend time with them, and I would go to their house for supper after or during work. I would go sit down with them at the table, and often, and so that you're speaking about that is definitely I think that's a major thing that people can offer if they have a business in a church, if they have the capability to employ a fatherless child, then they can mentor them while the kid's making money, and it's a win-win situation. So that's so great. Now do your kids, do they end up working with them long term, or was it just a high school thing, or
Really well, high school and sometimes summers in college, because the amazing thing is that these relationships have continued. My husband passed away 13 and a half years ago,
Mm,
and my kids are still friends with these men from our church. I mean, last summer, one of my sons went and to an NBA playoff basketball game with one
wow,
of these men who's been pouring into him. Really, he knew my son before my husband died, and this was just a natural extension of the relationship. But, you know, these men have taken the time to know my sons so that they know what they need, know what they like. This one son loves basketball. He had an opportunity to take my son to see this basketball game, and so he did. This same man gives another one of my sons, who really is handy and loves to learn to fix things, and his own dad wasn't around to teach him to fix things. So this man gives my son some kind of tool for Christmas, so that and it's a
mm,
shared interest
that's
between
cool.
him and this man, and, yeah, it's just he's helping him build a tool chest
Wow.
just as his own dad might have done. Now, I will say this man's not trying to take the place of my husband who's not here, but he's gotten to know my oldest son, knows he wants to be handy, and is doing what he can to encourage him in that and teach him where he can how to do some things around the house. And it's just it's very organic, it's very natural, there's nothing flashy about it. It's just getting to know the kid and seeing where you can befriend them.
And that's how simple it is. I mean, it doesn't have to be super complicated. And I think the devil overcomplicates it where people think, well, I can't be involved. There's nothing I can do. And so that's what we want to challenge people with is you can be involved if you have a business or if you're good at working on certain things, or you know how to do different hobbies, pull these kids into that and help them with it. So I think what this man has done for your sons or different people in your church have done. The
Mhm.
problem is what's happening in our nation is there's not a lot of people that are willing to do this. And so like your situation and my situation are pretty unique. There are people, a lot of people out there trying to do it, but there's still a ton of people out there that could be involved in something like this, but they're not. And so I think this is so inspirational to just Christians that are listening to this. How can I be involved in helping a fatherless family? Well, take what you're good at, take what the resources you have, and go invest in them and do what you can. It's not that complicated. So, and I think that's what you're saying, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's not rocket science. There was a book that came out last year that I think is really important in this conversation, The Great Dechurching by Mike Graham and Jim Davis. And they talk about the reasons that people leave church, not necessarily leaving the faith or abandoning their faith. They stop going to church. And we all know it's really, really hard to walk with Jesus independently. And the Bible encourages we need to be in church, right? So it's you don't need to be a lone ranger Christian, but that's what is happening in great numbers across our country. Anyway, they found in a long and well conducted study that the second most common reason that people actually stop going to church is because there's been a dramatic shift in the family structure and divorce, death, separation, incarceration, all of those things are involved in that dramatic shift in the family structure. And so I think as Christians, we need to not only be conscious of the single parent families in our churches, but we need to be conscious of them in our neighborhoods and our schools. Another thing that I began to notice when I became a single mom is how many more single parent families I knew from school and how few I knew from church. And so
Mm.
I knew anecdotally that single parent families find it hard to go to church, but I didn't know statistically that it was true. And it is. So, all that to say, this isn't just an issue for the single mom and her son, sitting in the pew in front of you. This is an issue that affects your next door neighbor and your coworker. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be the person in your church, but
Mhm.
just make friends. Have them over. If you're not a hospitality person, meet them for coffee. Just get to know them and get to know their kids. And yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's makes them feel seen and known and cared about. And yeah, it's really crucial that we do think about these families.
And inviting them to things that you would normally just invite other couples to. So if you're a couple, not just like I love what you said, they invited you over to their pool on Sunday afternoons and different
Mhm.
events. Like we would invite when I was a youth pastor, we would invite single moms to even our Super Bowl party or different things
Yes.
we'd have at our house. Because a lot of times these families they aren't invited to those things. They think, well, we're inviting other couples that have kids,
Right.
right? Is it, I mean, and so the people
Yeah.
invited you guys, and so I think that's wonderful that you had that experience, and so for people that are listening, it doesn't have to be complicated. If you're having an event already, include these families,
I
right?
would say yes, absolutely. And there are some particularly sensitive times. For example, summer gets really, really long when there's only one adult in the home.
Mhm.
And don't forget, summer married parent families kind of tend to go off in their own little bubble, and everybody's busy. Kids have activities, vacations, you have family maybe that you need to travel to visit. Everybody has things they need to do, but summer is long and it's lonely, and holiday weekends in general. I remember realizing that Friday afternoon had become my Monday morning. in
Mm.
terms of the hurdles ahead. I realized I had this long weekend where there were gonna be no other adults, and it was gonna be me trying to find something that 3 boys wanted to do. 3 boys with totally different personalities, or I was gonna be running all the baseball carpools and the birthday parties and the basketball and all the things that they were doing, and I was gonna be doing it all by myself for
Mm.
3 days with very little adult contact or interaction. Um, Also knowing anniversaries, for
Yep.
example, friends know the anniversary of the day that my husband passed away and reach out to me and reach out to my children, sometimes by text, maybe a phone call, just to mark the occasion. It helps them feel seen. Knowing the day that dad left for good and
Mm.
marking that and just saying, I know today might be a hard day for you and I love you. Um, Anything that you can do to help that child or that parent feel that you're thinking about them and that you care about them and you realize that things are hard. All of those go a little bit goes a long way.
That's great. Now, what are some things that, and is there anything else that people did for you or your church did that could inspire other people to do for widows around them? Um,
Yeah.
what are some
I
any?
There's so many things. One that meant a lot to me was I absolutely hated teaching my kids to drive a car. And I mean, it's a war zone, right? You're so anxious and they're so defensive and it's hard. Um, and of course I did the lion's share of that, but there were several different friends that took each of my kids and just practiced driving with them on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
And it's actually good to have a multiplicity of teachers on things like this,
Oh yeah.
And things like, well, because I was a mom with sons, I didn't know how to tie a tie. And yeah, you can YouTube, but how much better to have a flesh and blood human being
Oh yeah. Yep.
teach you how to tie a tie, teach them how to shave, go shoot suit shopping for
Hmm.
that first interview that's coming up. Oh gosh. Well, there was one father. I mean, this is a biggie. This is long-term commitment. This was a man whose his own children were a little bit older, but when my husband died, the youngest was in 3rd grade. So this man started picking up my youngest son on Friday mornings and taking him to a nasty greasy spoon for breakfast and
That's
getting
great.
him bacon and scrambled eggs and whatever pancakes, whatever he wanted, and a Dr. Pepper for breakfast
Nice.
every Friday morning. And then he would drop him off at school.
Mm.
And he did that through my child's junior high years. And
Wow.
then when he came to senior high, he started going out with him usually for barbecue uh, one night a week.
Mm.
And it was that just weekly commitment. And most of the time, probably 90 to 95% of the time, they didn't talk about deep spiritual truths. Although I know there was definitely some of that kind of sharing. It
Yeah.
was, tell me how your week is. That son was particularly interested in debate, and so he would have him tell him the topics he was debating, and what are you arguing, and how do you feel about that? It was bacon and listening and showing up week after week and being reliable.
Yeah.
That's
That's great.
an amazing commitment, and my son and that man are still close.
See, I love this. This is you're speaking my language because that's what I had growing up, and that's what I try to get other people to do. And so I think we have the same heart on this stuff. Now, what about your soul care? Is there anything that people did for you to help you with your journey with being a single mom, and also just
Mhm.
making sure that you're good, doing good spiritually and mentally and emotionally and stuff like that?
Yeah. Yes, wow. So many things. Well, I was in grief, and I will say that most people who come to being a single parent have some acquaintance with grief. Maybe a little less if they, become pregnant out of wedlock. There's not a loss there, but in the case of divorce or death, there's a lot of grief that goes there. And so I think what we're talking about is caring for people who have great loss and great sadness in their life. And the sadness too of knowing that your children have one parent. There is some just inherent sadness
Mhm.
in that. So I mean these same folks from church. Gosh, they invited me to go out to dinner with them as couples, which is really refreshing. That doesn't happen very often, so that I would have an opportunity to be a grown-up with other grown-ups. Um, that's invaluable for a single parent. Remembering, again, the anniversaries or special things about that loved one that I had lost, knowing my story and what might be painful for me. This is a tiny thing, but I will never forget it. A friend of mine texted me when on her own birthday and said that she'd gotten strawberry cake for her birthday.
Mm.
And she and my husband had this inside joke that strawberry cake was really the only good cake. And she just remembered that little detail about my husband and shared that with me. Hey, I'm about to dig into my strawberry cake. And just little tiny nudges like that meant a lot. But gosh, the youth in our church also were really a part of our healing. There were some really great kids in the senior high when my kids were junior high and elementary school. So some of them came over one Christmas Eve when moms are kind of trying to scramble to get all the food made and hopefully have some presents hidden and, little that kind of thing, kind of some surprises to prepare, which is really hard when there's no one to take them out of the house. So they, a couple of years, took my sons to get cheeseburgers and
Mm.
then played flag football at the elementary school. And I had a couple of hours to myself on Christmas Eve so that I could do some of those little surprises that parents like to have for their kids on Christmas morning, and I could prepare those things. One year, one son got a drum set, and one of those senior high kids came over about 11 o'clock at night and helped me build the drum set. Actually,
Oh,
he built the drum set. I basically didn't do anything. He built the drum set so that when my son came down on Christmas morning, it was there.
mm,
And that was just it's again, it's just what might this person need help with? How
yes.
can I help? Teaching them how to drive, build the drum set. Those things made me feel loved and less lonely, even though a lot of times they were serving my children. Does that
Mm,
make sense? It's true for any parent
yeah,
that loving their child is the most wonderful thing that you can do for them.
it's true.
And when I'm sitting at uh, a speaking event for my child that was the debater or a basketball game, and someone from church who's not connected to the team at all comes and sits down next to me, and they just came to watch your child play because they love your kid. And they're sitting there talking with you, getting to, hanging out with you in the stands. Yeah, that speaks volumes. That speaks
It's
volumes.
That's great. Just being involved. I was just talking to a pastor this morning that's working with two teenage boys, and he's like trying to figure out how do I relate to them because he said he grew up from a good home. He had a good dad.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, just think about how the things that they're missing out on not having a dad in their life and to do what you can to try to fill some of those holes. And I mean, that's
Mhm.
that's really what we can do. I mean, you can't do everything for a fatherless family, but you just do what you can with the resources you have and the time you have. And so I think this is great. You've given some really valuable insights, and hopefully the people listening will be able to collect from that and say, okay, what can I do to help these families? Now let's jump into your book. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'd love to talk about your book and the goal of it, and just let's just break it down a little bit for individuals listening, but also for churches. I know you said it could be a resource for people in churches. So tell us more about your book.
So really what I began to do as I got to know other single parents and then actually began to consciously interview them because I wanted to see what the stories were, but also what we had in common and what the differences were. So I began to identify commonalities, even though sometimes the stories were radically different. What are some things that are struggles for everyone but are amplified when you're a
Yeah.
single parent? And so each chapter, or most of the chapters, focus on the way God meets us in that deficit or in that challenge. So I am speaking in each chapter to the faithfulness of God. So I'm speaking to the single parent, but I'm also inviting the church member to listen in on what the needs are. And then at the end of each chapter, about half the chapter is how can the church come alongside and help. So, for example, God's courage and our fear, God's comfort and our grief, God's strength and our exhaustion, God's
Mm.
presence in our loneliness, protection in our vulnerability. All of these common things that single parent families feel. Maybe not every, a single dad may not feel as vulnerable as a single mom does. Someone who has lot of financial resources may not feel as vulnerable as someone who doesn't, but by and large these are common threads. And then so I look at the scripture and talk about how God meets us in these needs, but then I turn to the church member and I say, this is how you can come alongside the single parent and
Mhm.
be a part of the body, bringing some healing and comfort and support to this parent and their kids.
And tell us, let's go look at some of these chapters. I mean, I see God's presence in our loneliness. I know that would speak to most single parents. They the loneliness is a big issue. So tell us about that. Tell us what some of the things you cover in that chapter. Just trying to kind of give people a little teaser of what the content would be.
Well, I talk about how no one's ever been lonelier than Jesus was on the cross,
Mm,
how he willingly walked into separation from God, which he had enjoyed, he's outside of time forever and ever and
yeah.
ever. And he willingly endured that. And so we can know that Jesus knows what it feels like and that he will never, ever abandon us. And then I talk about union with Christ
Mm,
and what that means for the believer, the way that we have the Holy Spirit with us always guiding and making his presence known, and how do we practice the presence of God. And then what it means for the church. We have this verse, Psalm 68:6, God sets the lonely in families, and we quote that, but what does that mean? I think it means first acknowledging that every single one of us knows what loneliness feels like, whether
mm,
we're married or not. And so this is actually something we have in common. And in reaching out to a lonely person, you're actually doing some work to alleviate your own loneliness. And so then I move into talking about hospitality and what that does and doesn't mean. For example, it does not mean that your house needs to be ready for a magazine photo shoot before you invite someone over.
yeah.
Hospitality is really about welcome. And so it doesn't even have to be in your own home in
Mhm.
order to make someone feel welcome. And, you can go for a walk together. Obviously,
Yeah.
inviting someone into a home is useful, but it's not the only way. And then I do in this chapter go and talk about some of those lonely times that we talked about. Evenings, summertime, Sundays can be quite lonely because
Mm,
a single parent family can feel very awkward at church, surrounded by what appears to be all these perfect, happy families. And being aware that getting to church is harder for the single parent. Just, it's hard for all parents to round everybody up and get actual clothes on their body and get them in the car and all that business. But it's doubly hard for the single parent, and acknowledging that they still may not feel super comfortable once they get there. As good as my church was, I still felt awkward sometimes when you hear an announcement from the pulpit about the upcoming family retreat and someone says, "So excited about the retreat. We've had 37 couples sign up already."
Yeah.
And you immediately think, Okay, where am I going to stay at the retreat? And are there going to be any programs or for me? And what about my kids? Are they going to feel weird because their dad's not there? And then you think, that's probably not for us. And that's a
Yeah.
shame. That's
Yes.
a shame. I share in the book that right after my husband died, one of my children said, "Does this mean we're not a family anymore?" And
Mm.
I think we really need to pay attention to this thought that is, I think a little more common in the church. And it is God's design that there are two parents. I mean, God did it that way because that's what's needed is two parents. Um, but single parent families are families. Absolutely, they're families. And so we need to recognize and value them as such.
Mm. I love that. And so how can I mean, now that we're talking about this issue, I mean, because it's such a thing with single moms, they would tell us at churches we'd speak at that they don't feel connected. So how can churches help single moms feel more connected? Any practical tips for that? That just things that you could say to pastors or church people?
I would say you kind of got to do two things at once. You got to acknowledge that their situation is different and their circumstances are not like the married parent families. They may need more support. They may need some community with other single parents. And yet, they really, really need to be accepted as full members of the
Yeah.
church. It's a tension, right? Because you wanna develop a single mom ministry, but at the same time, what they really need is to be enfolded with everybody else. And so, I would say in my experience, it's more helpful not to be segregated. I can make friends with other single moms, but it's much harder for me to enter into friendships with couples that I don't already know. And I, as a mom raising boys, really needed some men
Yeah.
as well as their wives to
Mhm.
be friends with. So I would say getting to know that single mom or dad. Well, I guess this podcast is more for single moms, but um and knowing what they need more. Do they need the company of other single moms more, or do they need, well, they definitely need to feel a part of regular small groups, Sunday school classes. I talked to one dad, for example, who wanted to join a small group. He was divorced, he was sharing custody 50-50, and there was no small group that included children at that time. So this one small group voluntarily changed their meeting time and welcomed children
Mm.
and had it sort of set up so some older teenagers watched the children. And so now they have a completely different small group experience. And his kids come with him when he goes and they don't come with him when he doesn't have them. But it was such a radical act of love to change the structure of the small group so this guy could bring his kids. And what's also happened because the kids are there is that the adults have gotten to know those kids.
Yeah.
And some of that mentoring that we were talking about has happened, and those friendships have grown up. And that's such a loving thing to do, to think outside of the box and say, well, what does this family need? And it turns out to be a blessing for all the other families too. Nobody else has to go find a babysitter anymore.
Yeah.
So they leave their kids at home. So that's just an example. You get to know them what does this family need? What do these kids need? What does this parent need? And ask the Holy Spirit how to help you meet them.
That's so good. That's so good. Well, we're about to wrap up. We have about 2 minutes left. I want to ask you in a minute where we can find your book and your ministry. But before I do, there's one part in the book here. It says "Afterword" by Mac Harris, single parented. Can you just touch on that real quick and tell us what that's about?
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to cry. My oldest son wrote that chapter, and if you want to read any chapter of the book, read that book because he talks about his experience being raised by a single mom, and in particular, how people loved him well,
Mm,
and it's really beautiful, and he obviously misses his dad and longs for his dad, and yet he has a full and thriving life. He's actually a youth minister.
that's great.
And yeah, yeah, and does a lot of, sitting with kids who have parents that are divorcing or a parent that's very ill or has passed away, and
Yeah.
so God doesn't waste our suffering, and he's really seen that.
We'll have to have him on the show sometime and interview him as well. Now, we have about a minute left. Just tell us where they can find your book and they can find more information about you.
Yes, well, you can go to Amazon or Zondervan Reflective to find the book. Westminster Books is also going to have it. You'll be able to find it any one of those ways. Hopefully, in your bookstore, Barnes and Noble, Target. Yeah, so that's been fun to see. I want this to be a conversation for the church. So, and then I'm at www.rootedministry.com. And I highly recommend our website for resources for youth pastors and parents and single parents.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anna. Thanks for being on with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean.
Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Let's Talk About Fatherlessness. We want to now challenge you to take the next step by either starting a single mom community group in your church or with your ministry, or by joining our network of God is My Dad churches and ministries. Isn't it a great experience to be able to start a single mom community group?
Yeah, and it's just, if you talk to single moms, a lot of times what they'll tell you is the one thing they're lacking is that community, just a group that they can go in and they know there's no judgment. Everyone may not have the same situation. Everyone doesn't know what they're going through, but they can go in and they know there's no judgment. And it takes that kind of that restriction and that wall down for them so that they can share and then that they can grow in Christ.
And our single mom community groups are a wonderful ministry. And if your church can start one, we'd love to have you. We can help you get set up. We have the curriculum and all the resources you need. If you can't start one, we'd love to have you start by joining our network of churches and ministries, our God is My Dad network of churches and ministries, where you can get your church or your ministry on our map, and people can find you and find your ministry in your church so that they can get plugged into your church or ministry locally. So check that out. You can find all these resources at lifefactors.org. We have books, we have all kinds of content on there at lifefactors.org. Check it out today.